For this class and for class next week, then, we have three topics to discuss. First, the New Deal and its significance for the interpretation of the United States and its future. Second, the war economy. And third, political economy today at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. And it's that third element, and then the debate about the alternatives, the alternative responses to the present situation, which will then carry us into next week. So let me begin then, just making a few initial remarks about the New Deal. From a worldwide perspective, we could see the New Deal as the American version of the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the rich countries of the North Atlantic world. It was what we often describe as the social democratic or social liberal settlement. And we can understand this settlement as a kind of bargain. Under the terms of this bargain, the forces that threatened radically to reshape power and production relinquished or were forced to abandon this threat. And in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to attenuate inequalities generated in the established form of the market order by resorting to tax and transfer, that is, progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, and to stabilize the economy through counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy. There thus emerged what has been the default position of the progressives ever since, which is the humanization of the established market order, rather than its institutional and legal reconstruction. The New Deal was the American version of this operation. If we view the New Deal expansively as what you could call the long New Deal, we can distinguish four moments in it. The first moment was the early institutional experimentalism, which was really just the first year of Roosevelt's term in office, 1933, and the first half of 1934. The second moment was the narrowing of this earlier agenda to a focus on antidotes to economic insecurity. The third moment, which we're going to treat separately, was the war economy, the radical reorganization of the United States in wartime. And the fourth moment was the aftermath. So I now make a few remarks about the first moment. Roosevelt came into office with a very experimentalist attitude. Here is a typical remark of his. He said, "The country demands, the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, it demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it out. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." So this was Roosevelt's fundamental attitude. And driven by this attitude, he sought to hear many different voices in a practice uncommon among politicians. But now we have to ask, what was the content of this institutional experimentalism? It's also common among politicians that they think that when they need ideas, the ideas will appear. But as we know, as Shakespeare says, you can call the spirits, but they may not come. The stock of institutional ideas is relatively inelastic, and everyone is at the mercy of the ideas available to him. So it is astonishing to register that despite Roosevelt's radically experimentalist intentions, the content of his experiments, in fact, was very similar to the content of the policies undertaken by other advanced countries at that same time, including the fascist and Nazi dictatorships. And it was the common view, even, for example, in the papal encyclicals of that time, like the encyclical of Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno. There were two elements in this early institutional encyclical, in this early institutional experimentalism. The first element was the use of government to be an employer of last resort, the direct employment of workers made jobless by the Great Depression by the state. And this was the task of the Works Project Administration and of the regional development initiatives like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Workers were employed directly by the state if there was no private source of employment. The second element in the institutional experimentalism was the principle of concerted action, coordinated management of the economy and of competition by the government, with the aim of stabilizing the economy rather than of democratizing it. So Hugh Johnson, who was the head of one of the signature initiatives of the New Deal, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, said, the very heart of the New Deal is the principle of concerted action in industry and agriculture under the supervision of government. So this is what, under today's vocabulary, we might describe as corporatism. The state then sought to manage competition, to incorporate big business and organized labor in itself, to orchestrate a stabilization, a kind of economic peace that would limit competition in the interest of stabilization. This was the second, and in some sense, the predominant element in the New Deal. The National Recovery Administration itself was ruled unconstitutional in 1935 in the Schechter Poultry case. The Supreme Court held that this activity of the government was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority to the executive, and also an unconstitutional assumption of power by the federal government to regulate matters beyond interstate commerce. And so this early institutional experimentalism, despite the great fanfare and despite the enormous experimentalist energy that drew it, was hemmed in a sense, came to a close. And the result, the outcome, is very similar. For example, very similar to what, and no American wants to hear this, but it's the truth, very similar to the economic policies undertaken by the Hitler regime in its early years. Both of the elements, the use of the state as an employer of last resort, and this managed competition based on deals with big business and with labor.
And fascist Italy.
And fascist Italy, of course, also. And this whole ideology of establishing an industrial peace between capitalists and workers was also, as I mentioned before, propounded by the church just to show how much it was in the air as the dominant theme. Instead of class conflict, cooperation between capitalists and workers in these enterprises that would then be guilds, as the British describe them, as in guild socialism. This was the dominant spirit. Now, I say all of this because subsequently the New Deal became the object of veneration by the American progressives. The American progressives have trouble not sentimentalizing the New Deal. And even if we read the book that was assigned for the day, the Katznelson book, a crude version of the lesson it teaches is that the New Deal itself was wonderful, but it was based on a Faustian bargain in which blacks had to pay the price through the continuation of Jim Crow in the South. Now, a central part of my argument here now is going to be that the New Deal was not so wonderful, and though it was a remarkable achievement in many ways, it does not provide a model that could guide us today.
And just to pick up the other two main sources of fear, the limitations of the New Deal for Katznelson was the second, aside from the racial structure of the South, but the growth of weaponry, the United States becoming a military-industrial complex.
Yes.
That's a term that's still with us, that emerged during the war. And the third is that this understanding that liberal democracies could not compete with dictatorships. And so in the book that you've read, as you know, the United States ended up compromising with what he calls liberal principles to make common cause with adversaries, particularly fascist Italy and Soviet Russia, and to a degree post-war Germany. That there is, and so that he sees them as similar to these our allies in many respects.
Yeah. So this idea that the United States had to stand up
Yes.
to these dictatorships,
Yes.
and then it had to demonstrate that under democracy it could do the stuff that was necessary to achieve economic recovery.
Yes. And in so doing, not becoming a dictatorship, but having the government having a huge amount of power.
Now, it's a common view of this first moment in the New Deal that the New Deal deployed a kind of proto-Keynesianism, that the government spent money, that by this governmental spending there was recovery. But the truth is that the recovery failed very significantly. There was a decline again. There was a terrible crisis. And the real recovery came with the war. So the war was the real Keynes. And that's the truth that the idealizers of the New Deal, the view of the New Deal as proto-Keynesian, doesn't want to recognize. Now then, the second moment of the New Deal. The second moment of the New Deal, the funnel narrows. Let me preface these remarks with an observation that has been made about the New Deal that I think is very penetrating. The observation was that all of Roosevelt's programs failed, but the New Deal as a whole was a success. Now, to explain in what sense this could be true, we have to understand the difference between a real transformation and a grab bag of technocratic solutions to discrete problems. A real process of transformation is like a current, a waterfall. going in a certain direction. It generates dozens, hundreds of initiatives, all of them flawed, all of them ephemeral, partial functional substitutes for each other, and it doesn't matter that they're flawed. What matters is that it goes in a particular direction. What matters is its fecundity in the ability to generate new solutions, new partial flawed solutions, and to keep going. And then, by going in a certain direction, to create its own base of support as it goes along. This is the true nature of a process of transformation, and the fundamental way in which it differs from a series of technocratic solutions to discrete problems. And this is the sense in which one should be sympathetic and admiring of the New Deal. But in the second moment, after Roosevelt's early gestures toward managed competition and stabilization, corporatism, had failed or been rejected, defeated by his political and judicial opponents, the funnel of focus narrowed. It narrowed to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity. The signal expression of this narrowing was the Social Security program established in 1935. And here there is a point of very general interest to an understanding of institutionally conservative social democracy. And now I want to diverge from the American discussion and make some general remarks. So, the default position of the progressives ever since, not just in the United States, but in much of the world, has been institutionally conservative social democracy. The fundamental concern of institutional social democracy has been to establish for the individual worker and citizen a haven against economic insecurity, a basic set of safeguards against individual and public oppression, and of endowment assuring capabilities that would be excluded from the market and even excluded from the agenda of short-term politics. A haven in which the individual could be unafraid, rendered unafraid, fearless, and capable. But this is, as it were, only half of what one might want or what one should want for society. Why does one want this haven? So what is the sense of these fundamental rights? And let me now make a comparison of another character. A parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. So the idea is the individual is secure in this haven so that he can then flourish and act in the midst of a storm of experimentation all around him. That the surrounding social space can be rendered plastic, open to challenge and change, which is the only way in which we can hope to lift the grid of entrenched social division and hierarchy weighing on society. Institutionally conservative social democracy has the story about the haven. What it does not have is the story about the storm. And there's nothing in it that leads to this wider reconstruction in social life. That is its limitation. The history of social democracy worldwide has been the history not of the creation of this storm, of this deliberate institutional form of experimentation, but on the contrary of retreat. Social democracy has retreated to its last line of defense, which is the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements in Europe, its home ground, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. And this other version of a progressive position, which would be productivist and experimentalist, is not what has prevailed. So then we have the second moment of the New Deal showing this on the American ground. The focus becomes antidotes to economic insecurity, as in the Social Security program, but one could say also in finance. The so-called Glass-Steagall Act of 1935 had its main concern as preventing bank runs, preventing radical financial instability, and the main device by which it proposed to do this was to distinguish banking activities in which the banks invested their own money and took their own risks, and what was then subject to the federal guarantees of deposit, the federally insured deposits, which are separated. The proprietary trading was separated from the preservation of the insured deposits. And that too was in the interest of security and stabilization. There was one part of the American economy which was an exception to this principle, and that was the housing market. In the housing market, there continued to be genuine institutional experimentalism. The Housing Act of 1935 established the quasi-governmental enterprises, Fannie Mae and later Freddie Mac, and organized the market, the mortgage market, which became the main instrument of the deepening of the capital markets in the United States, and had the objective of allowing a large part of the population to acquire its own home. That was the exception to this abandonment of the larger agenda of institutional experimentalism. But the basic overriding proposition was this attempt to prevent insecurity, to make the individual secure in his haven, while renouncing the effort to reconstruct the larger social and economic space. John.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So, what would be the alternative?
Well, we're going to come to that, but so today, to anticipate some of this discussion,
Right.
because in the analysis and criticism what has been done, everyone asks, what's the alternative? And we could generalize this point about any kind of work or statement generally. Goethe remarks, whatever you do or whatever you write, people will say, where's the rest? But of course, the failures of these early Rooseveltian initiatives, their limitations, are their failures, whether or not we know what the alternatives are. It strengthens immensely the position of the transformers to defend alternatives, and we will discuss them. But the legitimacy of the critique does not depend on the ability to propose these alternatives. We have a problem. Right. It may be that we don't know how to solve the problem, but the problem exists whether or not we have the solutions ready. To my mind, a productivist progressive project today has three main focal points in these advanced economies. One focal point is the relation of the advanced parts of production to the backward parts. So what was beginning to happen in this historical period was what we now call Fordist mass production had become the advanced part of production. It was the successor to mechanized manufacturing. The large-scale production of goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor in very hierarchical and very specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. So it was the assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units, like factories, under the aegis of large corporations. And that was the practical base of institutionally conservative social democracy. It helped create this base. It didn't just meet this base, it created it. It created its own base, as every powerful political project does. Subsequently, this world has begun to disappear. It's the Rust Belt industries in the United States. The core constituency of the left-leaning parties in the West has been organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of industry. This is no longer the vanguard. It has ceased to be the vanguard. It survives today as a vestige, often based in remote parts of the world with much lower tax rates and much lower returns to labor, tax and labor arbitrage, or as a sidekick, a satellite to the new vanguard which we call the knowledge economy. So a new advanced practice of production arose, and it does exist in every part of the production system. However, in each part of the production system, it exists only as a fringe, excluding the vast majority of workers and of firms. So then we have this new dilemma of development in the world, which is that the old shortcut to rapid economic growth, which development economics taught us was conventional industry, no longer works. The alternative to it would be an inclusive, economy-wide form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But that alternative also doesn't exist. Where the knowledge economy exists, in Europe, in the United States, in China, or also in India and Brazil, and it exists only as this island or series of islands. And so this is the dilemma. The old formula doesn't work, and the alternative to it isn't available. What will we do? This is the debate. This is the very heart of the debate about development today in the world. The second problem is the relation of labor to capital. With the emergence of the insular knowledge economy, a large part of the labor force in all the advanced economies has been consigned to precarious employment. It no longer works under stable conditions in large productive units under the aegis of large corporations. And a significant part of the labor force has lost its connection to large organizations or business enterprises altogether. The instruments of the 20th century, of the mid-20th century, to deal with labor, to protect labor vis-a-vis capital, such as collective bargaining, no longer work for this world. And it seems inadequate to deploy 20th century methods to deal with these 21st century realities. The second focal point is the relation, the second focal point is this one, labor and capital, in which we need to have a different view to deal with these realities. We have two discourses in the world about labor. We have the syndicalist discourse of defending organized labor, but organized labor is now a small minority of the labor force. In the United States, it survives mainly in public employment, not in private employment. And then we have the neoliberal discourse, which under the slogan of flexibility, in fact, defends radical economic insecurity. So the question is how not to attempt to prohibit by decree, by law, what results from transformation in the realities of production, We can't just say these are illegal, these forms of temporary or conditional employment, because the law will not be able to suppress this transformation of the modes of production. But neither can we accept the reality of this precarious employment that results from this transformation. And the third is the relation of finance to the real economy. In all the market economies of the world today, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Well over 80% of the funding of production is internally generated in the production system. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's indifferent to the real economy in bad times. It's destructive in good times. The economy, finance becomes bloated. The economy is financialized. And it fails to be enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society. These are the themes around which I would propose a discussion of the alternatives. And none of them came to the surface in the New Deal. This was the agenda. This is the agenda that was left out, and it's our agenda. So the consequence, the implication is that the New Deal was not so wonderful as a model for us. It is understandable in its own time as a response to the crisis of that time, even though it resulted in, it didn't bring economic recovery. It needed war to produce recovery, and much less did it bring a democratization of the market order. But it's not a guide for us today. And so to learn correctly the lessons of the New Deal, we have to avoid sentimentalizing it in the way in which the American progressives conventionally have.
Right. Including, I mean, you read some of Ira Katznelson. He's seen as an American progressive. His book on the New Deal has done very well, both in the academy and outside. And he focuses on the problems of the New Deal. There are three sources of fear, which he says. Liberal democracies could not compete with dictatorship. The growth of weaponry created a military-industrial complex, and that the racial structure of the South could not be or was not addressed, and that the nation's deepest regional divide altered the country's history, showing how the commitment to this hierarchy of a racial order affected the entire New Deal policies and accomplishments. In one sense, Jim Crow South is central, but he's also pointing out the other sources of fear without addressing what Roberto essentially said. He's in my view, Katznelson is essentially a traditional progressive, but pointing out the limits of that progressivism that would be comparatively easy to overcome. The other two other points, and one is, if you remember, I think it was last week or the week before, the relationship between capital and labor also is connected to the relationship between a corporate state and an artisanal state, in a sense. That Lincoln and almost all Northerners, I mean, there's a long discussion going back to the 1840s of what's the relationship, actually going back to the Revolutionary period. What should the relationship be between capital and labor? For progressives, quote unquote progressives, certainly the Republican Party from its rise in 1850s through the Civil War was that labor was always superior to capital. The capital should be dependent upon labor and the talents and resources of laboring people. Then with the rise of big business and the incorporation of America, the relationship shifted. Roberto's question is in terms of the relationship between finance and the real economy, and this ongoing question of the relationship between labor and capital, along with those two questions remain
Yes.
foundational.
So on the question of labor, the United States adopted, beginning in Roosevelt's time, a
Yes.
contractualist labor law regime, collective bargaining, which the legal basis was the idea that in the employment context, the inequality of bargaining power between employer and employee was so great that contracts threatened to become a sham, hiding the reality of economic duress. And therefore, to reestablish the reality of contract in the very unequal circumstances of the employment relation, it was necessary to allow the workers to organize, to strike, to be represented collectively, to equalize the terms of bargaining power, and therefore to reestablish the reality of contract. Now, this was not the only solution to this problem in the world. And I'll now describe another solution, which was the corporatist labor law regime, which was established initially in Italy in the 1930s and widely imitated in Latin America, in Central and South America, especially in Mexico and Brazil and Argentina. Under the terms of the contractualist regime adopted by the Americans and then by the Europeans as well, was based on two principles. The first principle is that the decision to unionize is voluntary. The workers unionize or not. It is a prerogative, similar to freedom of contract, which they exercise or not. And the second is that the unions are completely independent from the state. They're not controlled by the state. The corporatist labor law regime, coming out of fascist Italy, was based on the two opposite principles. Everyone is automatically unionized by a combination of sectoral and territorial principles. And the unions are part of the state. They are supervised by the state. They are guided by a Ministry of Labor. They're effectively quasi-governmental organizations. Now, that was the initial model followed in Latin America. The problem of the contractualist system is the following. First, there's a huge struggle whether to unionize or not. And the struggle is often lost, so that now the unionized workers are just a minority.
Right.
And as I say,
A
a small minority
Very
surviving mainly in public employment. The second is that in an economy that is hierarchically segmented into vanguards and rearguards, more advanced or more backward parts, the tendency of this contractualist union system is to express and reinforce the underlying structural hierarchies of the production system. Because in the capital-intensive parts of production, the capitalists, the owners, the stockholders, have common interests with the workers against everyone else. The wage bill is a relatively small part of the cost of production, and they have an interest in making common cause against everyone else. So it reinforces these structural inequalities. And the third characteristic of this contractualist corporatist system is that it focuses attention on the purely economistic goals, wages and benefits, to the detriment of a larger institutional or public agenda. But of course, the problem of the corporatist system is that it then makes the union subservient to the state, and it therefore restricts in labor this deepening of democracy that we desire. So what's the solution? The solution might be to imagine a hybrid form of regime, which takes from the contractualist regime the principle of complete independence of the unions from the state, but takes from the corporatist regime the principle that everyone is automatically unionized. That would be for the organized, stable part of the labor market. And that would be a solution for the organized part of the labor market. We would say everyone is automatically unionized, and so the unionization is a gift of the law. But the unions are independent for the state. And different movements within the union structure, affiliated or not to distinct political parties, compete for position in this unitary labor structure, just as political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of a democratic state. That would be the idea. But that idea would be pertinent only to the organized part of the labor market. We still have the other problem of precarious employment. When there is no connection to large business organization and the workers have no stable employment. For them, we would need an altogether different legal regime, which we can also discuss. And the premise, the starting point, would be to distinguish genuine flexibility from the cheapening of labor. So, for example, you might say there would be a sliding scale. The more this precarious labor is organized and represented, the less there has to be direct legal intervention in the employment relations. But the less they are organized and represented, the more the need for this intervention. And what is the principle of the intervention? The principle of the intervention is to distinguish legitimate flexibility from illegitimate cheapening of the returns to labor. So there might, for example, be a principle of price neutrality. Labor performed under conditions of temporary, unstable, or precarious employment has to be remunerated at levels comparable to the remuneration of similar labor undertaken under conditions of stable employment. But that's just the beginning of a long discussion. So that's all to say that none of this was an object of the Americans or Roosevelt's New Deal. This is a world of considerations about the relation between labor and capital that presupposes the ability to reconstruct the market economy. So I go back to the principle enunciated in an earlier class. There are three things we can do with the market. One thing is to regulate it. The second thing is to attenuate the inequalities it generates through retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer, progressive taxation and social entitlements. The third thing is the most important, which is to change it, to change the legal and institutional architecture of the market. These alternatives that we've begun to discuss now in the context of the argument about the New Deal are examples of the reconstruction of the market in the relation between labor and capital, or in the relation between finance and the real economy.
Any questions, visions for in response? I'll start with another question for you all, for particularly Roberto, which is you mentioned the divide between private firms and public firms, and most firms today are public. Are private. And what difference would it make if all
What do you mean?
firms...
You mean public Employment by the state versus employment by private firms.
Both employment by the state and employment by private firms, but also the nature of whether the firm is a public company or a private company. Is there a relationship? Does it matter? How much does it matter that a company is a public company?
Now,
Versus-
what do you mean by a public company?
Meaning a corporate form of organization, meaning it has shares and anyone can
They're
be
publicly traded.
publicly traded. Yes,
Well, I think that's secondary.
that's secondary.
Doesn't seem to me to be central to these arguments, or does it? Does it to you?
I'm wondering that. I'm wondering.
I mean, obviously, if it's publicly traded, then it's subject to more intensive regulation.
Yes.
And the regulation could be an avenue by which
Right.
public concerns are made to weigh on the decisions
Right.
of the firm.
And
But-
in most public corporate, well, there
But
was
if a company is privately held, taken over and made, it used to be public, but it's
Right.
turned made private,
which has been the
it-
trend.
which has been the trend, these public concerns can be imposed on it anyway by another means. So it's not necessary that its shares be traded publicly for it to then be the object of this public scrutiny or public responsibility. Private equity can be made accountable also, right?
To a degree, so the question is to what degree, or I'm thinking of a public firm. There was a period in which most public corporations, all employees, especially after a certain amount of time working there, received shares of that company
Yes,
as part of their compensation.
yes, the quasi-wage benefits.
That's right. In a way
Stock-based compensation.
That's right. In ways that private firms, private corporations,
Yes.
have never done.
Yes, but stock-based compensation is a way in which the elites remunerate themselves. You're talking about it as if it were a progressive thing, but in the United States, it doesn't mainly function that way. There's the employees of law firms, the partners in law firms, the employees of the investment banks, they receive a large part of their returns in the form of quasi-wages.
Right, but in the 40s and 50s and in part of the 60s, there was a trend toward corporations giving all employees public shares as part of their compensation.
Yes, I think that in reality, though, if you were to look in detail at those arrangements, what you would tend to see is that it is the richest, most capital-intensive businesses that did this.
Yes, that's true. It's
And
true.
they are the ones in which, as I said, the owners have common interests with the workers because the workers are their partners and
Yes.
the wage bill is a small part of the cost of production.
Yes.
So you're describing this as if it were a progressive thing, but in another sense, it's a conspiracy of these
Yes,
of these
that's true,
capital-rich
that's true.
parts of the economy against everyone else. That's what in fact happened.
With the exception, I mean, it's not that common today of what was then known as, I'm thinking of a company like AT&T when it was a regulated monopoly.
Sure.
So their profits were vigorously, there was a ceiling, there was a payout, and so every employee at AT&T for decades received not just wages but shares of the company, and it was seen as, from a financial perspective, it made no sense economically to have competitors in an industry that required the kind of capital
Yes.
that necessary to create a new firm.
Yeah. So the general critique that emerges from this argument of the first two moments of the New Deal, the early institutional experimentalism and the narrowing funnel of safeguards against economic insecurity, is that it was about economic insecurity and economic restabilization, rather than about economic growth and economic democratization. So what it was far away from was the association of a growth agenda with an inclusion or democratization agenda. And that is the focus
Right.
of what we would need today. So that's the sense in which it's not a model for our agenda today. If
Sure.
if these
Yeah, but
arguments
that-
are taken.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear what others think, but I mean, how could we convince the electorate or the people to embrace a democratic agenda over an economic agenda?
Yeah, so we have to go by parts, right? So as I say, every powerful transformative project has to create its own base.
Yes.
That's what Roosevelt did. That's what all the social democrats
Yes.
did. And
But they were
But-
within the progressive.
but we have, but it's not possible to discuss everything at the same time. So I think what we're focusing now on is the programmatic element, the idea of the alternative. Because as I said early in my argument, Roosevelt, like everyone else, was at the mercy of the ideas available to him. And these were the ideas that were available in the world in the 1930s of managed competition and safeguards against economic insecurity. This other world in which we think what matters is energy, creation, construction, innovation. And whether it's narrow or inclusive, that's a different agenda. And that was beyond the historical horizon of that time. And even beyond the horizon of such a radical experimentalist as Roosevelt was. But now we come, let me jump ahead momentarily to the fourth agenda, to the fourth moment, and skip over the third one because we're going to come back to that soon of the war economy. The fourth moment was the popularization of consumption. Once these antidotes to economic insecurity were assured, the object was to create economic growth on the basis of popular consumption. And popular consumption, as we shall see, enabled by what became the real strategy of economic growth in the United States, cheap money. And so that's the world in which someone asked Roosevelt, well, shortly before his death, what book he would like to see in the hands of every Soviet child, and he answered the Sears Roebuck catalog, because this then was this.
I do remember that.
This then became the basis. So from corporatism to Social Security, from Social Security to mass consumption. Yes.
I wanted to ask if there was some significant opposition to the New Deal in the creation of the New Deal, first and second, and how that opposition maybe influenced the creation and development of the New Deal.
Oh, of course, there was fierce opposition.
Fierce opposition.
There was fierce opposition, and the opposition was carried on in politics and in law.
Yeah.
And so the Supreme Court was a tool of the opposition, and many of Roosevelt's programs were invalidated constitutionally.
Which is why Roosevelt wanted to pack the court and expand.
So even though the agenda, as I'm portraying it, was very narrow,
Yes.
it was not narrow enough for the country of that time. And Roosevelt had this huge problem, and this brings us to the discussion of, he was operating within a world dominated by those two forces, the weakness of democracy and the weakness of thought, to which I referred before. But I think we have to keep separate the question of whether the measures were moderate or extreme from what direction they took. Because what I'm afraid of is that in this answer to you, it may seem, well, if even these things that he did, which were very moderate, were considered too much, how could your agenda, which seems much more expansive, be thinkable? But I think it's very important to keep separate the question of moderation or extremism from the question of the direction. So I'm not saying that Roosevelt's steps were too modest. I'm claiming that they were steps in the wrong direction. That's a different kind of argument. Whether they were modest or big is a wholly another matter. They were not steps taken in the direction of economic democracy and of socially inclusive economic growth. They were steps taken in the direction of restabilizing and securing, restabilizing the economy and securing the individual. It was the war then brought the recovery in the United States, as in Germany, as in much of the world. Now let me go back to what I said was the third moment of the long New Deal, the war economy. The war economy is an astonishing episode in American history. Because in the war economy, the Americans who were supposedly devoted to these sacrosanct principles of market organization cast aside these principles and organized the economy on a completely different basis. And the results were nothing less than sensational. As I said in an earlier class, in 4 years, in 3.5 years, GDP in the United States more than doubled. And if we open the black box of the war economy, we see the combination of two elements. The first element was massive mobilization of resources. Physical, human, financial, technological, for the war effort. The volume of military procurements in the first 6 months of 1942 was greater than the whole GDP of the United States in 1941. So this is a vast operation. But this massive resource mobilization was conducted under completely different principles. Basically, the government, the national government, organized a flexible, free-floating coordination with big business. So it's not to be idealized because under the cover of this, oligopoly advanced. The Congress in 1942, through the Small War Plans Act, tried to introduce small businesses, but largely failed. So, and the instrument was the National War Boards, War Board, and a series of others. The Office of Price Administration, the National Manpower Commission. These executive bodies had wide-ranging authority to commandeer capital and labor, to tell business, produce this, and this was like a radical solution to the problem of the meeting of supply and demand. The government was the buyer, it assured demand, and the government assured supply. And if you imagine that there can be an open frontier of both supply and demand, the economy can expand exponentially. Because every increase of demand is then an increase of supply. The supply creates the demand back and forth with no end. And private incomes were expropriated. The top marginal rate of the personal income tax at one moment exceeded 90% in the United States, which is inconceivable to Americans who are alive today. So now, what is the meaning of this episode, we have to ask. So it shows that the Americans were not, or what they seem to be. That is, they seem to be just puppets of this fetishistic market ideology. But when they needed to, they shoved it aside and did something completely different. So
That turned out to be very successful.
that turned out to be extraordinarily successful. So, and this prompts a wider reflection, which is the significance of the ability to cooperate as a fundamental source of worldly success. And the Americans are one of the nations that have proved extraordinarily adept at cooperation. Maybe their illusions about themselves being a classless society are a classless society are part of the background to this disposition to cooperate. There are countries in the world which have tried many institutional models and failed at all of them.
Right.
And there are other societies, the United States is one of the first, which have had very few institutional models, but have been extraordinarily successful in all of the ones that they've tried. So they were successful on the market, and they were even more successful when they cast aside the market. So social capital, the ability to combine, to organize, to cooperate, to associate, is a source of power and worldly success and a great mystery in social life. We think of it as a constant attributed to culture, but it is in fact a variable. We can help create it. We can create through initiatives, through institutional initiatives, we can form social capital. And this will be another object of our discussion. So what is the lesson of the war economy? Because the war economy was treated as an exception, not relevant to the management of the peacetime economy.
Right, right.
But one might say, what one might desire as a slogan by which to describe a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy is a war economy without a war.
That's right.
Huh? And that's one way of describing what a productivist project would be.
That's right, which leads to a huge increase in social capital.
Which is dependent on a huge increase in social capital, and in turn produces
yes,
it.
that's
Yes.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
So this is an unexplored topic in American history, right?
Yes, yes.
Because it's as if this black box had never been opened, never examined, and its lessons not absorbed.
That's right. I mean, the only way in which it's been analyzed is among in the humanities and history and literature. There's been some scholarship on the relationship between a consumer and producer society. And when the United States moves from being a producer society to a consumer society, and the standard narrative is that only right after World War II do people begin to, most people in the United States begin to think of themselves first as consumers, second as producers, or participating in a producer society. And that's really as far as it goes.
Yes.
That's as far as it goes. But the model of a war economy yoked and social capital, within that war economy, if you look at what scholars are saying about the relationship between consumption and production, Americans widely saw themselves as producers, as helping to bring about this regeneration, both in terms of goods and services and in terms of a revitalization. So I think there could be a way of yoking together the kind of, call it a concept of identity. You know, who am I? Am I a consumer? Am I a producer? And how does that relate to the notion of a social capital as part of a war economy?
Yeah.
Questions, comments, queries, rebuttals? Does everyone understand? Yeah, go ahead.
believe that that big segments of our population went from thinking of themselves as producers to thinking of themselves as consumers. Because if you look at the advertising that was done during the war,
Right.
a lot of it said, we'd love to produce things for you, but we can't. We're in the middle of the war, and we'll be there for you when the war is over. This was particularly true of car ads that I've seen a lot of.
But then when the war ended, they turned into consumers, right?
Yes.
Right, but it's not that people weren't, it was that they couldn't be.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So the premise of all of this stands out in contrast to the world that we described in the first half of the 19th century.
Yes.
Remember?
Yes.
Which white America, the North, was a society of independent entrepreneurs,
Right.
smallholders, artisans, craftsmen, and the National Developmental Project, the Hamiltonian Project, converged with selective democratization in agriculture and finance. So if you transport that model to today, the question is, if that ideal had not been narrowed by institutional idolatry, the inability to generalize the idea of institutional reconstruction, and by the weakness of democracy, the Americans would have to have a similar project today, a producerist project, a productivist project.
Right.
And part of that project would be lifting up the immense rear guard in the American economy by a 21st century equivalent to the 19th century agricultural extension.
Yes.
And that would be the beginning of this transformation in which the individual worker and citizen would be seen as a producer and as an agent,
That's right.
not simply as a beneficiary to be entitled
Right.
or to be preserved against economic insecurity, but as someone who could do things. Now, the reality of an insular knowledge economy is that creation and profit is quarantined in these islands.
Yes.
Everyone else in the society and the economy is condemned to some kind of make work.
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah, that's exactly
And
right.
they get to consume, they get to have fantasies of escape and empowerment on television and in the movies, but they're completely disempowered. And among other things, disempowered as producers and as agents.
Right.
So one has to say that the evolution of the New Deal was part of the historical background to this reality. It's and not of this idealized background of how things should have been. Now, if you think, as many of the contemporary Americans think, that the salvation of the United States is to become the Sweden of 1970, then nothing went wrong in the New Deal. It was
That's
it
right.
was trying to become the Sweden of the 1970, and it paid this Faustian, made this Faustian bargain of conceding to Jim Crow in the South,
Right.
which was terrible, a terrible sin. And now the sin has to be lifted. So
And
now what we have to do is to complete the work of the New Deal by the Civil Rights Movement. That's the lesson
Yes.
which the American historians teach, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Okay, so everyone is silent here because in the rest of America there would be radical disagreement with everything that has been said here, but here there is silent
Yes.
consent.
Yes.
As an alternative to the current market structure, what do you think about the policy of universal basic income?
The policy of so this is an interesting question because it's not an alternative to the current market structure. It's an additional element in the idea of the haven. So taken all by itself, universal basic income, social inheritance. It's just more safeguard. So the market remains the same, but you give the individual a guarantee. Now, if you were reconstructing democratic politics, creating a high energy democracy, democratizing the market order, then universal basic income or its equivalents would have a completely different meaning. Because then you would say, the object is not to secure the individual against the insecurities of the present market order. The object is to make him able to be a co-architect, a
Yes.
co-sponsor of the new order.
Yes. A producer, right? Yeah.
A producer, an agent.
Yes.
So I think any initiative taken in isolation, any initiative like that one, depends for its meaning on what it's a part of. And as it's presented now in the world, an idea like universal basic income is part of the Sweden of the 1970s agenda. It's not part of the experiment, the Storm agenda, right? Were you going to say something? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if both of you could maybe share some thoughts on what role or place like the question of social reproduction would play in this kind of alternative systems.
Now, what do you mean by social reproduction?
Well, particularly with the New Deal, right? You know, there's this huge influx of cultural work. There's funding, federal funding for different cultural aesthetic projects. Massive, the kind of building of the entitlements that are critical to family formation, family structure, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, someone like Michael Denning sees that as a kind of like really politically vibrant zone, but I'm wondering should the state even play a role in the question of cultural reproduction, funding those kinds of things? I don't know.
But I'm not exactly clear what the focus is. Is the focus the family or culture, or what are you seeing as the...
Maybe it's all of them. Maybe it's none of them.
So I think generally what's happened is, so we tell a broader story about this. There has been a parting of the ways between modernism and leftism, right? So, so if our public imagination is shaped by the assumptions and resignations of institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism, we think the public world is not a world in which you should pursue the sublime, right? Its focus should be marginal gains in equity and efficiency, fairness. Everything that is hot is privatized. So religion, art, family experiments, this is the hot stuff. And the hot stuff is separated from the cold stuff. That's the idea of this world. And I would want to argue that there should be no such separation. And that in a world in which the sublime is privatized, our view of the sublime will be perverse because we can't imagine it translated into collective forms of life. And then if the state gets involved in the financing and support of these forms of private experimentation, the perversion increases, right? Because it's as if we would say, we'll keep the lid on the cauldron, but we'll let some of the hot air blow out through these private experiments, these fantasies of empowerment and escape. Now, of course, the critic could say that privatized hot stuff could one day be mobilized to support the public stuff. But that's not what it is in the first instance. That would be the result of a subsequent evolution, right? So,
I love your use of the term sublime because it fits perfectly. There's a long-standing definition of the sublime as something that's both terrible and delightful.
Yes.
It yokes together terror and delight. So it's
That's Burke's definition of the
yeah,
sublime.
and the Kant's,
Yeah.
and I mean on tap to today, but it is a definition that I mean that wonderfully, in my view, fits the yoking together of a war economy and social capital.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so let's begin. Let's set up the stage for next week's discussion.
Okay.
And by now speaking about the evolution first the political evolution and then the economic evolution in the late 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. So that's now. So we're not talking about things in books, about these past people who are dead. We're talking about ourselves. And so first, the political narrative presented now without apology and without anesthesia. So the progressive forces, including the putative Progressive Party, the Democratic Party in the late 20th century, failed to come up with a powerful and plausible sequel to Roosevelt's project. Limited as Roosevelt's project was, it was a project. It was a powerful project. It created its own constituency. It responded to the anxieties of that time. The last gasp of the New Deal came, in a sense, in Lyndon Johnson's presidency with his war on poverty. And there was a telling difference between what Johnson did and what Roosevelt had done. So Johnson's war on poverty was focused on the very poor. It was targeted because the technocrats, the advisors, advised him to target his assistance programs to real need, to demonstrated need. Now, Roosevelt had avoided this. And he had avoided it for the same reason that the European Social Democrats had avoided it. He had insisted on a universal program, Social Security, for the broad majority of working people, refusing to target because, and then everyone would be lifted up together. As the European Social Democrats always did. This was a fatal mistake because once the focus of public assistance is narrowed to a specific group, it will then becomes vulnerable in economic downturns, and it's easy to turn against them in politics. That was the last gasp of the New Deal. The progressives failed to come up with a productivist project, a strategy of socially inclusive economic growth, and the only strategy of economic growth in the United States, the only real strategy was cheap money, and cheap money as a basis for mass consumption. And instead, the progressives turned on the one side to what Katz Nelson said Roosevelt had failed to attend to, which is the questions of racial justice, of racial oppression. But they did it in the form, which we'll discuss later in the course, of this threshold view of race separated from class. And one of the consequences of that was to persuade the white working class majority of the country that it was the unspoken, the hidden victim of this conspiracy between the virtual representatives of the minorities and the sanctimonious white elites. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, the progressives turned to a contest of moral and religious sensibilities, in which a secular agenda of a secular or modernist agenda was confronted with a traditional or religious agenda. The signature issue was abortion. And one could have a discussion about this contest. In that discussion, my position would be that both of the agendas were morally primitive, and that it was in the interest of the people to continue to struggle, that the struggle would lead them to a higher level of consciousness. Instead, one of the two sides captured the federal judiciary and attempted to impose its moral agenda on the other side. And that ended, as we have recently seen, in a defeat. So in this circumstance, the white working class majority of the country, a large part of it, felt that its interests and aspirations were not being recognized by the Progressive Party, the progressives, and that the progressives weren't doing anything for them economically. At least let's not let them offend us morally and religiously. And that then became the basis of the conservative ascendancy in the United States in the late 20th century. For 50 years, the conservatives held power. Democratic presidents executed the conservative agenda just as the conservatives themselves executed it. The basis of this hegemony, of this conservative hegemony, was a combination of material concessions to the moneyed interests, to the interests of the American asset holders, with moral concessions to the moral and religious sensibilities of the moneyless classes. That was the basis of the conservative agenda, of the conservative ascendancy. And that then brings us to the present day. Now, none of the fundamental problems of the country could be solved or even addressed within the limits of the established economic and political institutions. None of these problems that I've described as the concerns of a progressive political economy. The hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward sectors, between vanguards and rearguards, the relation of labor to capital, the consignment of the majority of the labor force to precarious employment, the financialization of the economy. Finance becomes bloated, it becomes hypertrophied, and ceases to serve the interests of production. It absorbs not just a huge amount of profits in the economy, but talent. So half of the graduating class of Harvard College goes into the finance houses or into management consulting. And almost no one is inventing anything or producing stuff. They're just paper pushers. So that's then the world that results from this, from this thing, in which the Democratic Party becomes its base in the so-called middle class, in fact, the working class, the white-collar working class, the credentialized part of this working class, the Republican Party based on the uncredentialized part of the working class, and the state takes initiatives that are mainly examples of upward redistribution, that is, subsidies to capital, to one or another part of the, as in the health industry, the semiconductors, and so forth. This is a situation that has resulted. And then they look back and they say, well, why can't we be like Roosevelt? Those were the golden times, right? When we just discussed that they weren't so golden after all. And now we come to like the economic part of this story. So there are two vectors. So one is the basis of economic growth. So in the closing decades of the 20th century, the United States became dramatically more unequal. But the basis of economic growth was mass consumption. Now, how can mass consumption, which seems to require the democratization of purchasing power, be reconciled with inequality, with radical inequality? To square that circle, one of the things that needs to be done is to replace a property-owning democracy by a kind of fake credit democracy. That is, the democratization of credit has to take the place of the democratization of wealth and income. The democratization of credit made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And that then became the basis of the run-up to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. The basis, the immediate basis, was the cheap money policy. Near zero interest rate, money is for free. Allowing the democratization of credit, but above all, expanding the wealth of the asset holding classes through asset bubbles in the stock market, for example. And a hidden enabling circumstance of this operation in the United States were the structural imbalances in the world economy. So prior to the crisis of 2008, the prime motor of growth in the world economy was the combination, the interplay between the deficit economies and the surplus economies, and especially between the United States and China. So the Chinese exported their capital surpluses and their trade surpluses and exported them in large part to the United States. And the United States had its trade and capital deficits in part financed by the Chinese. And this became the single greatest motor of growth in the world economy. Now, what's interesting is the following. Each of these two countries used these structural imbalances in the world economy, these trade deficits and trade surpluses, as a way of escaping the imperative of internal structural transformation. So the Chinese had reason to shift their focus from export-led growth to deepening of the internal market, and to have a strategy of economic growth in which export-led growth, rather than being an alternative to internal deepening, would be complementary to it. But any such shift in the strategy of growth would require massive redistribution within China, among sectors, among regions, among classes. And it was therefore politically threatening to the authorities, to the state. So by this combination with this partnership with the American deficits, the Chinese were able to escape facing this circumstance. The Americans, the same thing. So by allowing the Chinese to finance their deficits, the Americans were able not to generate a productivist project of their own. So that's the way in which each used the other to escape. So this, and now the underlying story, the most important part in this narrative, is the change in the form of production. So for this mass production, the previous advanced form of production, conventional industry, typified above all in the Rust Belt industries in the United States, declines. The political economy of the progressives is purely defensive. Let's buy a few more years for them through subsidies, through constraints on plant closings, prohibitions of offshoring, and so forth. And in this respect, The right and the left had the same basic proposals in the United States. Huh? This then became their project, and a new advanced form of production emerges, the knowledge economy, in this insular exclusive form. Rather than deepening and spreading throughout the production system, it remains quarantined. And instead of spreading, it becomes more quarantined for the following reason. The owners and controllers of these advanced sectors discover a way of bifurcating their process of production. So part of the process of production, they commoditize or routinize, and that part they subcontract to firms and workers in remote parts of the world. And the creative and lucrative part they keep for themselves. So it's the opposite of dissemination. It's a kind of hyper-insularity that characterizes the knowledge economy. That's the underlying basis. And that basis then destroys what had been the social and economic foundation of the Rooseveltian project of social democracy, and creates this world in which the progressives have no productivist project, and the white working class majority feels offended in its moral sensibility without being protected in its economic interests. And so that's the main vector, the vector that has to do with economic growth. Now there's a second vector that has to do with finance. So finance becomes bloated, it has more and more profit, it has more and more talent, it sucks the life out of the economy and the society. And in this way of arranging the relations between finance and the real economy, there are three enigmas. So the first enigma is, what is all that money doing there, all that liquid capital in the banks and the stock market? Theoretically, it's to serve the productive agenda of society. In fact, it has only an episodic or oblique relation to production. The production system, as I said before, is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Second enigma is an asymmetry. Finance seems to be indifferent to the real economy in good times and becomes destructive in bad times. And third enigma, the most important responsibility of finance, which seems to be the creation, the production of new assets in new ways, which is the responsibility of venture capital and its equivalents, in fact is a minuscule part of the total operations of the capital market. It's tiny. And always has been. It's like, less than 1% of the total operations of the market economy. So in this world, then, finance develops this predatory parasitic relation on the real economy, on the productive agenda of society. And one might think, as a first principle, that the best way to make it less dangerous would be to make it more useful, to enlist it in the productive agenda of society, prohibiting the forms of finance that had no colorable relation to the expansion of output or the rise of productivity, and finding new ways to mobilize the dormant capital of society in the service of production. So that's then the economic background to this political circumstance. That brings us to today. And the response, I want to argue, is a democratized market order and a high energy democracy. A political economy guided by objectives and deployed by methods that are fundamentally different from Roosevelt's. So the idealized Rooseveltian past is not the guide. We need another pattern.
Very good. Questions? Responses? Yes.
Excuse me. This is not a fully formed thought, but I guess what I'm interested in when we're talking about like reshaping and reforming things, is the role of political voice in today's society.
The role of what?
Political voice.
Right.
And how a lot of the political engagement is concentrated at the top. And just like how does that funnel into how we can reshape an economic system if a lot of the voices involved are those who kind of benefit from it.
So there are two parallel operations, right? Create energizing democratic politics and democratizing the market, which is reconstructing the market. So it's not just humanizing the market by compensatory redistribution. Now, in energizing democratic politics, part is elevating the temperature of democratic politics, which is the level of organized popular political engagement in political life. So remember that claim I made in an earlier class that I hope we'll come back to in a couple of weeks, which is that it's false to say that we have to choose between a cold institutional politics and a hot anti or extra institutional politics. To return to the formula, we don't have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. We can have a politics that is hot and institutional at the same time. And that has to do with a host of very practical things, like the rules of voting, is it optional or mandatory? The electoral regimes, the relation of politics to money, the relation of politics to media. The cumulative effect of changes in all those dimensions heightens the temperature of politics. And I would want to argue that only a high temperature politics can be rich in structural content. So that's one of the elements of voice. That's voice.
Right.
Huh? Well, to start with a very modest example of this. The vote in the United States is optional.
Yes.
In many democracies in the world, the vote is mandatory.
Yeah. In fact, possibly most.
Yeah.
But
Now, the Americans are horrified by this idea that the vote should be mandatory. But you have to understand what it means. What it means is you go to the voting booth every 2 or 4 years. If you don't go, you pay a fine. You have in the voting booth the privilege of abstaining. So all it's saying is every few years you have to reserve a few minutes of your time to the affairs of the Republic. It's a kind of minimal burden. Now, why are the Americans offended by that? So they have a declaratory system of an income tax which absorbs much more time than these 10 minutes to vote. They have jury duty, if necessary. In the past, they had military service. So why do they only complain about this? So in a country in which there's mandatory voting, abstention has a completely different meaning from the meaning that it has under optional voting. Because if you don't vote where there's optional voting, it could mean you think everything is fine, and your abstention has no significance. If you don't vote in a system in which there's mandatory voting, you go to the voting booth and you abstain, that has a significance. You reject those options. So, for example, in one election in Argentina, in which there were more abstentions than there were votes for either of the candidates, the elected candidate was totally discredited because of the significance of abstention in a system of mandatory voting. So that's just an isolated example, huh? And I'm not saying that anything would be what I want to resist is the idea that the degree of political engagement, to take that as an example of political voice as you described it, is just an invariant fact of culture. We can't do anything about it. We can do things about it. There are a series of practical initiatives that reshape things that are supposed to be cultural. And that would change the experience of American democracy. Now, it seems to me that there's another angle from which one could approach these things. So, if you have a situation in which the right represents the cause of production, of growth, of energy, and the left wants to humanize what the right does, which has been the situation since institutionally conservative social democracy became hegemonic, the right controls the agenda. Because in politics, the force that most credibly embodies the cause of energy, innovation, construction, sets the agenda. The others are just sugarcoating it. And by saying, what is the role of the progressives in the system of institutionally conservative social democracy? It's to put a human face on the project of their conservative adversaries. So they then become the humanizers of the inevitable. And this is not what the progressive idea should be. It should be to provide the alternatives, the alternative direction. Now, the alternative doesn't have to be conceived as a blueprint, distant from what exists. It's a direction. And the direction begins in small steps in your circumstance right now. So that's the kind of debate that we're trying to propose.
Yes.
I'm curious about your consideration of foreign threats to internal democracy and how much that might have affected the metamorphosis of the United States from a pacifist pre-World War II economically depressed economy to one where ever since, even following the Cold War, we have our productivist project that is in the military-industrial complex, right? Even in the 1990s with minimal foreign threats, still having such a huge military budget. So that the national security anxiety that we've replaced Pearl Harbor with 9/11 of, combine that with simply the recent ideological changes to how economy is organized. I'm thinking about both on the left and the right, populist candidates being very protectionist. And even though, not to draw too many parallels between 1930s and now, which are just incomparable in so many ways, but the threat of liberal democracy stability, combine that with our solutions to either the Great Depression or current economic anxiety. In the sense of climate change, our solutions are not necessarily economic growth, they're sustainability, stability, right? If we're thinking about the remedies.
Yes.
So I guess my overall question for you is, when we think about the next metamorphosis of the American economy and how we think about how we ideologically organize that economy, is that possible without external security threats or without significant government bipartisan approaches to that organization?
Well, let me say, I don't think, in principle, I don't think that the need to make war, to wage war, to defend against war, is necessarily subversive of democracy. I think the opposite. So, if the citizens are united to defend their republic, that in principle can be a source for the energizing of democracy. Let's focus on one aspect of that, which is military service. So, the Americans accepted in Nixon's presidency, right?
Yep.
The substitution of a conscript army by a paid army, a mercenary army. They called it a professional army. And now all the Europeans have done this also, with some exceptions like Switzerland. And so in a republic, a republic can allow part of the citizens to be paid to defend the other citizens. That's the anti-republican principle. But that was accepted in the United States without a murmur from the progressives. They almost universally applauded that. So if you have that mercenary army, you're going to have an army of poor people to fight the wars of rich people. And then that's for these expeditions, in which the United States, like the war against the Barbary pirates, that's the equivalent now, in which you can have that, the hands of the people in office will be untied. If the children of the elites had to go to war and died, it becomes much more difficult to wage war. So the principle has to be, in a republic, the armed forces, the army is the nation in arms. Every citizen is a soldier. And if he's exempted from military service, he then becomes vulnerable to mandatory social service. And he gets basic military training to be part of a reserve force that can be mobilized in conditions of national emergency. So I don't see why military threat in and itself is in any sense anti-republican or subversive of a republic. Revolutionary France, to take another example, it was encircled, it was opposed by all the autocracies, and it fought against all of them successfully because it had an army of citizens in which engaged the whole nation. So it seems to me that the problems of national security can be exploited to suppress public freedoms, to destroy these republican principles, but it can be more naturally the opposite, depending on the arrangements we have. Yes?
I'd like to make a comment there. So when we think about, let's say, existential threats, and it's not purely military, say climate change, for example, right? It's not as immediate, but the remedies that are needed are.
Yes.
So when we talk about a war, not necessarily a violent war, but you brought up LBJ's war on poverty, right? Let's say a war on climate change. Whatever it is, when it is clear that government policy should take immediate action, but there is, let's say, either internal obstructionism or just not ideological consensus on it. Point being, with climate change, similar to World War II, the government could raise demand and supply significantly and make that metamorphosis if needed. But unlike World War II, it's not a realized immediate threat. And so I'm wondering about whenever future metamorphoses take place, such as the question about universal basic income, how much maybe not militarily, but just existential threat to the preservation of the country is necessary for that really to be realized. Otherwise, it seems like we are in a perpetual similar system of, yes, maintaining the military budget as our big productive.
We would have, it's no good conflating all of these threats into one big mysterious threat. We have to discuss each of them one by one. So take environmentalism, climate. The predominant temper of the environmentalism of the rich North Atlantic countries is that environmentalism is a kind of post-structural, post-ideological politics. So history has disappointed us. Its terrible conflicts and ideologies. Now let's seek refuge in the great garden of nature. And then we think this is what comes. But that's not how we should think of it. What we should think is that any particular emergency, like climate, environmental issues, is a provocation to reinvent the ideological and institutional debates in new forms. So if we're going to decarbonize the economy, for example, and that happens within the present structure of things, that will impose massive sacrifices on the poorest and most vulnerable people. So we then have the occasion, the need to reorganize to avoid that. So any particular emergency then becomes in the hands of the would-be transformer a pretext and an incitement for reconstruction, not a reason not to reconstruct.
Superb answer.
Now, John, didn't you, it's actually 3 o'clock
It
and
is,
you had
okay.
said that you.
So I
Yeah,
have
you go before.
another departmental meeting vote that I have to leave
Well,
for.
our time is over
And our
anyway.
time is over anyway.
But the idea is that in the next class, we're going to continue this discussion.
Yes.
And we're going to relate the critique of the existing arrangements to this question of the alternatives. Because I don't think that the alternatives should be left to the end of the course. We should discuss them now.
I will read those, the article that you mentioned when you were in your office.
It's too bad we don't have Jill Lepore here.
Well, yeah, we will, because she was